Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Christos Kolokathis. I work as an associate at the Regulatory Assistance Project, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Today, we'll be looking at regionalization of the European electricity market with a special focus on the European Commission's proposal for regional operational centers, and we'll also provide recommendations for improving the proposal to get the most value from it. Before introducing the presenters, we will just spend a minute to go through the logistics of the webinar. So the presentation will last around half an hour, and then we will dedicate the rest of the webinar to go through an extensive Q&A session. We hope you'll have lots of questions for the presenters. If you would like to submit a question throughout the webinar, please use the questions pane on your control panel as you can currently see on the slide. We are also recording today's webinar, so we'll be sending a link to the recording and the slide pack in the next few days. And with that, please allow me to introduce our energy experts for today. Phil Baker. Phil has extensive experience in the power sector, accumulated over a long career spanning the entire sector from electricity distribution and transmission to generation and electricity markets. For many years, he was responsible for the overall operation and planning of the transmission system in England and Wales with National Grid. In that role, he was involved in the merging of 5 separate control areas into one single control area and control center in Wokingham for the entire England and Wales. He has also led the development of policy for wind technology and grid integration of renewables for the UK Department of Trade and Industry. Our second presenter, Julie Finkler, is a law and policy advisor at the environmental law organization ClientEarth, focusing on EU energy, climate law and competition law. Julie has worked on issues concerning the legal frameworks regulating distribution and transmission networks. She also has experience providing legal support concerning climate and energy governance issues, state aid cases, participation by consumers in the energy market, and the revision of the institutional framework of the EU internal energy market. And with that, we are ready to start our presentation. Phil, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Christos. Well, market regionalisation is moving apace in Europe en route to a fully integrated European electricity market. Regional day-ahead markets are well established. They cover something like 85% of consumers by demand now, although there are a number of boundaries that still need to be included in the market coupling process. Intraday markets are becoming established as well, with the Crossborder intraday project delivering next year and hopefully bringing greater harmonisation to intraday trading. And we're also making tentative steps towards regional balancing markets, with a number of trials looking at specific products in place, although progress is noticeably slower than in the day ahead and intraday market timeframes. So market integration and regionalisation depends on having the necessary infrastructure available, and Europe, I think, is very fortunate in having a very strong and extensive interconnected transmission system. It has 5 synchronous areas indicated there, I think 36 member states or connected countries, and 43 individual transmission system operators, TSOs, cooperating to ensure a viable and ongoing operation. And we also have NSOE, the European Network of Transmission System Operators, undertaking common tasks such as forward planning, adequacy forecasting, and of course the development of a very comprehensive suite of network codes that promote harmonisation in the areas of demand and generation connection, market operation and system operation. And just using the analogy of a concert orchestra, you've got sort of 43 individual players all playing their instruments, hopefully from the same music score, trying to produce a synchronized performance. And you may feel that the performance might benefit from a conductor someone to coordinate the individual contributions and produce a more harmonious performance. Well, so why do we want to integrate electricity markets and the underlying transmission systems? Well, regionalisation and market integration bring real and very significant benefits. I mean, looking back in time, public electricity systems first emerged in the early years, excuse me, of the last century as very small local systems, but technology advances allowed them to grow and merge to cover ever-increasing geographic areas, expanding from local to regional to national, and now in the case of Europe, transnational systems, all in the pursuit of certain classical benefits. And I think it's interesting to note that very similar debates are underway elsewhere, for example, China and India, again in an attempt to realise the very significant benefits that regionalisation can bring. So what are those benefits? Well, essentially access to the cheapest resources, allowing more customers to access the cheapest generation sources, the pooling of risk, only having to cover the largest loss seen by the system as a whole rather than those seen by each individual bit of the system, reduced capacity requirements, balancing capacity surpluses and deficits within the interconnected system to reduce overall capacity and investment requirements, and balancing over wider areas, taking advantage of geographic and technical diversity to reduce overall balancing requirements. And lastly, and also sort of looking forward, of course, the need to integrate renewable generation in the most cost-effective fashion has highlighted the benefits of larger systems covering wider geographic areas. So what are the potential benefits associated with full market integration? Well, there's a range of estimates. Figures here, 12 billion to 45 billion euros by 2030, estimates derived from various sources, including the report that Booz & Co did for the Commission a couple of years ago. And where you end up in that range depends very much on what level of interconnection is developed to support market integration. And just looking at how those savings break down, taking the sort of largest maximum figures, you may get up to sort of 7 billion euros a year for reduced capacity requirements, 3 billion a year from shared balancing resources, and maybe up to 5 billion a year from the impact of demand response. But the bulk of the remainder really is associated with price convergence. But regionalisation brings challenges as well as benefits, and if all those benefits are to be achieved, then these challenges will need to be addressed. And just looking at a couple of those challenges, the need to maximise market efficiency. I think for regional markets to work well efficiently, interconnection capacity offered up to the market coupling process must be maximised in order to maximise price convergence and the associated gains in social welfare. But it's quite clear that the capacity of interconnection currently offered up to the market is relatively low. And this slide is from ACER's recent market monitoring report for 2016, which compares aggregated available HVAC interconnection capacity offered to the markets with a sort of maximum or benchmark capacity which could be offered. And it shows that on average only something like 40% of the available capacity is offered to the market. So apparently plenty of room for improvement. And I think one of the most significant reasons for this low offering is the practice of some TSOs to reduce interconnection capacity in order to minimise internal congestion and the associated costs of redispatch, and also other unscheduled flows. And it's really a clear case of TSOs acting to reduce national costs at the expense of social welfare gains, which could be seen across the region as a whole. And I think it's also interesting to compare HVAC utilisation with that of HVDC, where unscheduled flows are not really an issue. And ACER show that HVDC capacity offered to the market is about 85%. And while that's a figure that could probably be improved on, it does give an indication of what could be delivered by HVAC interconnection. So I think it's a clear case generally of a more regional approach being required to deliver the potential very significant benefits of regionalisation. The second challenge to think about in terms of regionalisation is security of supply, and this chart, which again is from ACER's market monitoring report, shows the interconnection contribution assumed by individual member states when they're assessing their resource adequacy requirements. And it really makes the point that regionalisation does imply increased member state security interdependence. So assuming an interconnection contribution at the investment stage implies that external support will be required in real time to deliver reliability, and that the regional procedures and focus will need to be in place to ensure that that contribution can be delivered when it's required. And again, a potential conflict arises between regionalisation and national responsibilities and liabilities. And the events of last winter where Southeastern Europe had experienced a very cold spell, leading to some TSOs reducing or even banning exports in order to protect their national consumers, demonstrated that the appropriate procedures are not currently in place. And it does give rise to concerns that when push comes to shove, national priorities will dominate. Again, it's a clear example of where a more regional approach is required to deliver the potential benefits of regionalisation. And these tensions are apparent in the ROC debate, or the debate on regional operational centres. The Commission has proposed the creation of regional operational centres to carry out near real-time tasks of regional relevance with some decision-making authority. And I think it's fair to say that in general most member states and TSOs would want to manage regionalisation via increased cooperation rather than giving up existing accountabilities to regional entities such as ROCs or regional operational centres. But before getting into the sort of ROC issue in detail, I thought it may be worth just reminding ourselves of the origins, of their origins. And I think the origins really lie in the events of November 2006, when Europe's electricity networks split into 3 separate zones, and I think something like 15 million European electricity consumers lost supply. And following that incident, the EU called for a gradual evolution to regional system operation. And following that, 2 coordination centres, part of the Regional Security Coordinator Initiative, the RCI, were voluntarily established in 2008 and became known as Regional Security Coordinators, or RSCs. And in 2016, a multilateral agreement was signed requiring all TSOs to participate in the RSC initiative. And RSCs were formalised into European law effectively by the adoption of the System Operation Guideline in 2017. And then finally, as part of the Clean Energy Package, the Commission has proposed the creation of Regional Operational Centres, or ROCs, which really an enhanced version of the RC concept. And currently we have 3 RSCs in being: CRESO, TSC Net in Munich, and the SCC, with a Nordic RSC, I believe, to be established by the end of this year. So is that a good place to stop to see if there's any questions?
Yes, we haven't received any questions, any clarification questions as for now. We will have an extensive Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So we will answer all more content questions during that. Just a reminder that if you want to send any questions, use the question pane on your control panel. So Phil, please continue.
Thanks, Christos. Well, just looking at the Commission's proposal for regional operational centres and comparing those proposals or the proposed functions with those of the RSCs as envisaged in the system operation guidelines. Well, I think the original RSC duties were really limited to providing TSOs with some regional security services and providing a general overview of power flows at regional level. However, the RSC functions defined by the system operation guidelines are rather more comprehensive, and they include things like short-term adequacy analysis, outage coordination, the creation of a common grid model, coordinated capacity calculation, which is obviously important from the point of view of increasing market efficiency, and defence under restoration plan consistency assessment. And the Commission's proposal for ROCs really extend the RSC tasks and include certain other tasks of regional relevance, such as the regional sizing of balancing reserves, plus the creation of procurement platforms, so clearly important in terms of accessing the savings in balancing costs we referred to earlier. A role in assessing external generation contribution to capacity mechanisms, very important in promoting a regional approach to resource adequacy and accessing the costs associated with that. Identifying regional crisis scenarios if delegated by MSOE, coordination in crisis situations when they actually occur, and training and certification in matters and tasks of regional relevance. So I think that's basically where we are in terms of technical tasks, but probably enough from me at the moment. So handing over to Julie, who can tell us a little bit more about governance issues.
Thank you very much, Phil, for that. So with the technical task to be given to the ROCs, we consider the Commission's proposal is a good step towards achieving the benefits of regionalisation. But these benefits cannot be achieved without the appropriate rules and arrangement for regulating the powers of the ROCs and for dealing with regional governance issues. So for these reasons, I would like to present and discuss what these arrangements are and whether the regulatory regime proposed by the Commission is fit for purpose. As mentioned by Phil, the Commission has proposed several technical tasks to be assumed to be given to the ROCs. The Commission's proposal will give the ROCs different powers in relation to these technical tasks, including the power to issue recommendations to the TSOs, which are non-binding. And the Commission also proposes that the ROCs should have some decision-making capability. This decision-making power will concern only a limited number of tasks, in particular concerning tasks where there's a tendency to take national approaches, which then may restrict competition and trade, and which then may affect the regional welfare. So for example, concerning the functions pertaining to coordinated capacity calculation or for calculating the capacity available for foreign capacity and capacity mechanisms, where there's a tendency to ignore or to underestimate the contribution of interconnectors to adequacy. If TSOs do not agree with the ROCs, they have the ability to ask the ROCs to revise their recommendations and binding decisions. But TSOs can only decline to implement the ROCs decisions in extreme cases, that is, if the system's safety will be compromised. And this is because under the proposal, TSOs have the main responsibility for maintaining the safety and secure operation of the national transmission system. TSO are also required to state the reasons for not complying with the recommendations. And this is important to ensure sufficient levels of accountability, but the justification is only available to ROCs and to the other TSOs, and there is no such requirement to publish a justification regarding the decisions made by the ROCs. Could we move on to the next slide? Thank you. Given these new powers attributed to the ROCs, the creation of these new entities must be supported by strong and credible governance, including by arrangement for the corporate governance structure of the ROCs and for the monitoring. So what does that mean, for instance, in terms of corporate governance for the ROCs? Under the proposal, the management board of the ROCs will be composed of members representing the TSOs, which will have voting rights, and also of observers representing the NRAs of the region where the ROCs will be established with no voting rights. So, the TSOs will maintain a key role, a central role, in establishing the internal structure and the internal operational arrangements of the ROCs. And TSO will also develop the rules and the methodologies that will be applied by the ROCs in their day-to-day operation. For instance, TSOs will develop the methodologies under EU network codes and guidelines, which will provide the basis, which will be then used by the ROCs for issuing their recommendations and decisions to the TSOs. So we can see that TSOs retain an important control over the ROCs under the system, and we fear that this could potentially limit the ability of the ROCs to make independent decisions, and this can also be evidenced by the fact that the ROCs have no formal legally binding duty to act independently, and this may be problematic because ROCs will make decisions which will have great implications for all market players, and there is a risk that confidence in the ROCs will be undermined if market players consider that certain market participants are able to control the ROCs. The Commission also proposes new arrangement for the governance and the supervision of the ROCs and for the regulatory regime that goes with it. Under the proposal, national regulators, otherwise known as NRAs, have the main responsibility and powers to supervise the ROCs and to ensure that they fulfill their functions effectively under EU law. These oversight responsibilities will require a high level of cooperation between NRAs. For instance, to decide what data and behaviors need to be monitored, to decide when they should intervene and make joint decisions, and to develop a general common understanding of cross-border cooperation when it comes to system operation. But it is unclear to us whether the Clean Energy Package provides the right framework for NRAs to cooperate effectively. For instance, it is not clear what happens in the event of a disagreement between NRAs or if no actions are taken. And also compared to the NRAs, ACER, which is the European Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, has a more limited role in overseeing the ROCs. And in addition to that, ACER doesn't have a sufficiently clear mandate to coordinate cooperation between NRAs when it comes to the ROCs. So this could be quite problematic because a lack of cooperation or bad cooperation at regulatory level could hold up the progress in coordinating ROCs and could slow down the adoption of decisions which are essential for the good functioning of the market and also for reaping the benefits of regionalization. Another issue in this governance system is that NRAs tend to be bound by their national accountability, so there's a question as to whether they are best placed to judge regional issues. So having stressed these concerns, we consider that some improvements to the Commission's proposal are needed moving forward, and Phil is now going to share with you recommendations for improving the technical tasks of the ROCs.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Although the Commission's proposals for ROCs and the tasks that they perform are very welcome and I think address the challenges we face in accessing the full benefits of regionalisation, we do believe that more could be done. And just to highlight a couple of areas, in terms of resource adequacy, the Commission correctly proposed that a role for ROCs in identifying what capacity can contribute to neighbouring capacity markets and also in short-term resource adequacy monitoring. However, we think that the role of ROCs should be extended to include regional resource adequacy assessment and investment timescales. And this could form a bridge between the pan-European assessments to be carried out by NTOE and the more detailed national assessments that are and probably will be carried out by member states into the future. And they could clarify areas such as what contribution should be assumed what interconnection contribution should be assumed in national studies. And you might have noted from an earlier slide we put up that the very significant difference in contribution to resource adequacy assumed by member states, by different member states in terms of interconnection, it literally ranged from 100 to 0%. So there's a clear need for a more consistent approach, and we believe ROCs could actually provide that. In terms of regional crisis management, we believe that the role of ROCs in identifying scenarios could be extended to include a greater role in coordinating responses to events should they actually happen, in order to ensure a regional focus to that response. And that, for instance, that would have helped in managing the sort of situation we saw last winter when national priorities seemed to rise to the surface and TSOs started closing down interconnection. So I think it's back to you now, Julie, to tell us how the Commission's proposals could be improved in terms of governance.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. So we've just outlined some of our main concerns regarding the governance framework regulating the ROCs, and we consider that some further improvements are needed to create a regional approach to system operation that is fit for purpose. First, and more generally, we would like to reiterate that maintaining the ROCs decision-making authority is important to ensure that actions made by TSOs are carried out in the interest of the system, and to ensure that the potential reductions of trade and export capacities are limited to emergency situations only. And this approach, in a sense, will allow the ROCs to deliver the benefits, particularly in terms of facilitating the sharing of resources, ensuring a cost-effective integration of renewables, contributing to greater security of supply, and lowering costs for consumers. Second, TSOs should be required to systematically explain why they decide not to follow the recommendations, but also the decisions put forward by the ROCs. And TSOs should make the justification policy available to all stakeholders, and not only to the ROCs and other TSOs. And that would ensure more transparency in public scrutiny, and ensure that market players and other stakeholders are able to scrutinize whether TSOs decline only on technical grounds or for other reasons. Third, ROCs should be established as entities which are independent of national interest and which have a clear regional focus. So this is all the more important given that the ROCs will have to balance between different interests, and this process needs to be neutral and technical and not political. In a sense, under the new system, member states may take actions that they would otherwise not have taken, but the idea is that thanks to these actions, member states will receive benefits that exceed the cost of the actions, and these actions will not only benefit them, but will benefit the whole region as well. And finally, a stronger regional cooperation at regulatory level is needed as a prerequisite for improving and moving forward with the regional approach to system operation. In practical terms, we think that ASA is well placed to address issues that are linked to the ROCs, as these issues can be dealt with more effectively at the regional or at EU level rather than at national level. And this is particularly important considering that the different ROCs will have to cooperate with each other and that EU-wide monitoring will be needed. So we consider that ASA should have a great role in the establishment of the ROCs, in their monitoring to ensure minimal levels of harmonization and to promote cooperation and interoperability between the different ROCs. ASA should also be given a more prominent role in coordinating NRAs. For instance, NRAs could be required to act in the new regional groupings of NRAs that will be created within ASA, and so that they could use these groupings to adopt the decisions and recommendation when it comes to the ROCs. ASA should also have a clear mandate to solve disagreements and disputes arising between different NRAs to ensure that progress takes place even where NRAs disagree or fail to act. So in conclusion, we think that this set of recommendations will create a credible framework for ensuring that governance and system operation keep up with the regionalization of markets, and also to ensure that member states and consumers are able to benefit from the regionalization process. Phil is now going to tell you a little bit more about what could exist beyond the ROCs and how a regional approach to system operation could look like in the future.
Thanks, Julie. Well, the future, I mean, finally, I think despite the current debate around ROCs and the tasks that they should or shouldn't perform, it seems pretty clear to me that we are on a bit of a journey in terms of regional system operation. We've already moved significantly from the original vision of how RSCs would operate when they were first introduced in 2008, and we've seen them take on more tasks and have a greater role. And I'm sure that as ROCs or RSCs or whatever you want to call them become established and their worth in accessing the considerable benefits of regionalisation that are potentially available, as we see, we will see their roles and influence grow. I mean, what the ultimate destination of all this, I don't know, it's a little uncertain, but the idea of a regional ISO is one obvious endpoint, an entity that would oversee the management of all the market assets that are critical from a regional point of view in the interests of fully accessing all the benefits of regionalisation and ensuring that the interests of the region as a whole are at the forefront rather than the interests of any individual member state. And that could be described as a regional ISO heavy, if you like, and there may be other outcomes. It could be described as a regional ISO light. But I think, going back to the analogy with the concert orchestra, I do think some form of regional conductor will be required if regionalisation is to really work effectively and efficiently, and most of all safely as well. So,
right. Thank you very much both to Phil and Julie for a very interesting presentation. You've kept to time as well, so great, thanks from me too. We have received quite a few questions and we'll focus on these for the next half an hour. If you still want to submit a question, you can do so. And so let's move to the first question, which I think it's a very good one. It's about consumers. All this at the end of the day is about consumers. So the question is, what is the expected impact of ROCs on electricity prices? Phil, would you like to say a few words maybe?
Right, well, hopefully very positive. Just going back to one of the earlier slides where we showed that the bulk of benefits are likely to come from market coupling and price convergence and things like that. I mean, that should have a very beneficial effect on electricity prices because consumers should be able to access the cheapest electricity resources. And, obviously there will be gains elsewhere in terms of reduced investment costs, balancing costs and things like that, which should also feed through to, the price that consumers eventually pay. There clearly will be a cost in setting up sort of regional entities, but I'm sure those costs will be very significantly outweighed by the benefits. So I would have thought that the impact of regionalisation on electricity prices should be wholly beneficial.
Thank you very much for that, Phil. And I think in the Booz & Co report that you mentioned earlier, actually there is an estimate of already delivered benefits to consumers in the range of 2 to 3 billion euros through market coupling as well. So in fact, only a very limited portion of the potential benefits has been realized so far. Okay, so we can now move to the next question, which is again very relevant for consumers. And many people fear that introducing the ROCs will compromise security of supply at the national level and could lead to blackouts. Do you agree with this opinion?
I personally don't. No, I think the whole point of regionalisation really is it's to make efficiencies and things like investment and stuff like that. So there will be less generation around, if you like. But the ability to depend on your neighbour, I think, can really only add to national security in the longer term. I think the important thing is that we don't get into a situation that we assume our neighbours are going to help us in the investment stage, And then when it comes to real time and those that support is really required, we suddenly find that the regional procedures aren't in place, and people just start to look after their own consumers, and that support suddenly becomes not available. And if you look at many of the emergency agreements TSOs have between each other, they're often based on reasonable endeavours rather than best endeavours, and there's a question mark about how reliable they could be. So I think solidarity and regionalisation can only help in terms of improving security of supply for customers.
Thank you for that, Phil. And a relevant question more from a legal perspective that has often come on the debate is how to tackle the issue of liability. So in case something happens, a negative impact on the grid for consumers, who is responsible for that? Julie, would you like to say a few words on that?
Yes, of course. So first, liability is a very broad word, but I think in our case, the question many are asking is about what happens if the ROCs are in breach of their contractual obligations. And the Commission proposal does require ROCs to put in place arrangement to cover the potential loss and damage related to the task that they carry out. But the proposal doesn't establish any harmonized system for the limitation of liability of the ROCs. But I think existing arrangement could potentially be used and could serve as a source of inspiration for designing the liability regime for the ROCs. For instance, under the current regime, the ROCs, such as, for instance, Correzo, are already required to develop liability schemes in cases where they breach their contractual obligations due to intentional misconduct and gross negligence. It's also interesting to note that under the current regime, there are also liability arrangements for TSOs when TSOs breach their own contractual obligations regarding the regional cooperation through the ROCs. And again, this responsibility limited to the direct damages caused by intentional misconduct and gross negligence. So my understanding is that such frameworks, for instance, a framework that exists for Correzo, could easily be reproduced and adapted to the new responsibilities and powers of the ROCs. And I think it's also important to note that provisions that are limiting the liability of utilities, of TSOs, and if we look at the US also, provisions that are limiting the liability of ISOs or RTOs are common practice, and they are just necessary to protect the stakeholders from liability arising from their ordinary negligence, so to say. So the same level of protection to be afforded to the ROCs. I think it's important that the liability is limited to gross negligence and that the recovery of indirect damages is precluded, because the potential damages associated with liability from ordinary negligence and indirect damages could be potentially huge for ROCs and TSOs. So with that limitation of liability provisions, the ROCs and the TSOs will be exposed to potentially excessive damages awards that will be reflected in higher insurance premiums, if that's even available, higher cost of capital, higher litigation costs, which in turn then will be borne by customers. So as I said, the current framework already provides for arrangements, and they could be potentially adapted to the ROCs.
Thank you so much for this answer, Julie. Bit technical for me, but I'm sure that people that understand the legal aspects probably got a lot of that. Okay, so moving on, I mean, Phil, you presented, a lot of the benefits that regionalization and the ROCs can bring to the market and to consumers. So in your view, what are the current barriers for actually developing the ROCs?
Well, developing ROCs and regionalisation in general, I think, I'm not too sure there are too many technical barriers. Obviously, you need interconnection. You now have sort of harmonised codes for operation, which clearly help. And I would have thought most of the barriers to actually proceeding with ROCs and regionalisation in general are soft barriers, things like member states, TSOs, NRAs in many instances not wanting to give up the accountabilities they have now and surrender those accountabilities to regional entities. Many reasons for that, but I think that they are the barriers that really have to be overcome if we're going to proceed, and I don't think there are technical barriers to stop us doing all this.
Thank you, Phil. And I'll jump from that one to a related question again. And you mentioned in your presentation that some TSOs constrain cross-border capacity, as has been demonstrated also by the recent Acer monitoring reports, in order to minimize the costs in their areas. So the question here is that maybe TSOs constraining cross-border capacity can minimize the costs in the short term, but what do you think about the long term? Is this a beneficial situation for TSOs, for consumers, and member states?
Well, I think TSOs constrain interconnection capacity to avoid redispatch costs, and that basically saves them money and their consumers money. But it costs consumers elsewhere in Europe lots of money as well. And I think, you do need to make the balance between national cost savings and the loss of social welfare elsewhere in the region. So, I don't have an awful lot of sympathy with TSOs restricting capacity. I think it's wrong. I think it's actually illegal under current law. And certainly as a long-term issue, I think it needs to be addressed.
Great. And a question going a little bit outside the EU. So are there any specific barriers in EU and non-EU countries in RSCs or the ROCs? So could you implement that outside the member state borders? I don't know if you have any views on this, Phil.
I can't see why not. The thing about ROCs is you're separating sort of the operational planning, the near real-time planning activities from control activities. That can or could lead to problems in terms of interfaces, and should be looked at in many ways as sort of a temporary solution, because you need to bring responsibility for real-time and near real-time activities together within the same entity. But as a step along the road, I think it's very appropriate, and I can't see why it wouldn't be applicable elsewhere in the world.
Thank you again, and I apologize because the next question is also for you. So the next question is in relation to resource adequacy, and you made a recommendation that the ROCs could have a greater role in relation to undertaking regional resource adequacies in the future. And the question is, you emphasize this, the significance of the role of the ROCs and a regional approach in assessing external contributions to resource adequacy. Do you believe that this competence to evaluate external contribution to resource adequacy will be enough to address the potential adverse effects of capacity mechanisms to the internal market? What else is needed? So it goes a little bit...
Sorry, Christos, could you repeat the question slightly? I didn't get all of it there.
So, sure, no problem. So do you believe that this competence to evaluate external contribution to resource adequacy will be enough to address the potential adverse effects of capacity mechanisms to the internal market? What else is needed? It goes a little bit outside the ROCs debate per se, but I think it's important in the context of the internal energy market, in fact.
Well, I think the first thing to say about that is that ROCs are in a very good place to make decisions about to what extent external capacity can contribute to domestic capacity mechanisms, because the domestic TSO is not in a good position to decide that. It's very much a regional issue. So I think it's very appropriate that regional ROCs carry out that role. And, you know, in doing that, in making sure that, you know, external resource is included in resource adequacy assessments can only be helpful in regionalising the whole approach to resource adequacy. So I think it's a very valuable step. Whether it's sufficient, I don't know. I mean, you know, the other way of approaching this is to concentrate on, you know, what contribution interconnection should be making to resource adequacy, national resource adequacy assessments, which is maybe another way of looking at the same problem. And, you know, there again, we would expect, you know, regional resource adequacy assessments to provide the answer to that question, because again, it's very difficult for individual TSOs to decide what's happening outside their boundaries, and hopefully, you know, that again will be the way forward.
Thank you, Phil, once again. And I have two related questions, which is in relation to ROC establishment as an entity. And the first question is more explanatory. How is the decision for allocation of a ROC taken? And the second related question is that whether, in our view, should ROCs be different and completely new entities, or will a CORESO and the other ROCs be further developed to become a ROC? If the first is the case, what happens to CORESO? And maybe, Julie, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, please. Can you please repeat the question? The first question, because I think you mentioned two different questions.
So the first question is how is the decision for allocation of the ROC is to be taken, and then should the ROCs build upon the current ROCs, and if not, what should happen? What happens to the CORESOs and all the ROCs that are existing at the moment?
Yes, so on the first question, I mean, I think it would make sense to build on the current system, especially because upfront investment costs have already incurred, and I assume that the current ROCs and the current ICRs and the now ROCs already have made some substantial investment and maybe IT technologies. So I think it probably makes sense to build upon them. And on the decision for allocation of the ROCs, are you referring to the system operation regions?
I believe,
and the definition of the region, or?
I believe that the question is yes, it's probably includes that as well.
So I think the Commission didn't propose a cookie cutter format for defining the boundaries of the system operation regions. There is also at the moment no upper lower limits for the number of ROCs, which I think is in contrast to the network codes, where there's a requirement that the total numbers of ROCs is not higher than 6. And under the proposal, ENSOE is preparing a proposal to define the regions, and this proposal is then ACER then has then the authority to decide on the configuration of the system operation regions where the work will be established. And I think in preparing the proposal, ENSOE is also required to take into account the existing ROCs as well as a set of other technical criteria, which I cannot mention now, but I know they exist. But I think there's nothing in the proposal that there's no provision in the proposal that describes the procedure to follow if ACER doesn't approve ENSOE's proposal, or if ENSOE puts forward amendments to the proposed region. And the proposal is silent on the need to review and redefine these regions over time, for instance, to increase efficiency or to accommodate for the changes in infrastructure power flows?
Thank you, Julie. And then I have a question with regards to renewable energy integration. And the question for you, Phil, is what do you think about the argument that a regional ROC, well, a ROC basically, may be less flexible with regards to RES integration than an individual TSO?
So if I fully understand the question, you're saying, is this an issue between regionalisation and sort of local markets, or is it?
No, I think the question refers more to whether a ROC would be more flexible or less flexible than a national TSO in integrating renewables.
Well, if you know, a ROC will be looking at issues of regional relevance. So if we're talking about, you know, big renewables, utility scale renewables, I mean, I don't see ROCs being any worse in that regard from TSOs. If we're talking about smaller renewables, maybe at distribution level and stuff like that, then, you know, I think that does probably need a national focus to work properly. But you know, in terms of renewable integration, you know, basically regionalisation has got to be a benefit and not a hindrance.
Thanks, Phil. And I'm just going to add very briefly on that. I mean, we've seen examples from other regions in the world. A very good example would be the Californian area, Western Interconnector area, where many states, many utilities are participating in a common balancing market, and you can actually see the benefits in terms of minimizing the curtailment of renewables. So I think, in fact, a regional entity will very much help to make sure that renewables are integrated cost effectively and that curtailment is minimized to the maximum extent possible. And you discussed very briefly localized renewables, and the next question is related to that, and I know that you also have a big interest in it. So are ROCs evitable in a further decentralized energy system? So on the one way you're going more regional, on the other way you're going more local with more distributed generation, demand response, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting sort of issue, and you know, it comes back to the fact that electricity markets generally are being pulled in separate directions at the moment. They're, on one hand, they're having to grow bigger and regionalise to gain benefits from that, but at the same time, electricity markets are having to become far more granular so they can accept consumers who want to generate their own energy, consumers who want to be active in the markets. And you know, it's difficult to see how the current regulatory regime really can handle that. And I feel it might give us a pointer to how regulation develops in the future, with NRAs beginning to focus more on national issues and making the market fit to accommodate smaller players, many smaller players that we're going to see in the future. And maybe relaxing their grip on things like regionalisation and allowing regional entities to develop that would enable progress to be made in that direction as well. So a really interesting question, actually. I'm not too sure I know the answer, but I think regionalisation, you know, regulation has to really change if we're going to handle all the competing pressures.
Thanks, Phil. And another question, thinking more about the longer term. You mentioned that for the future, maybe 2030 or even after that, an ISO type could be applicable or appropriate for an internal energy market. So the question is, would the RSO light or heavy work in the EU's target model setting with self-dispatch, or would this also necessarily entail a move to central dispatch system?
Sorry, Christos, could you just repeat that? I didn't quite get it all.
Yes, so in relation to looking further ahead, 2030 and maybe later, and if there is an RSO, light or heavy, established in the EU, would you also need, would this also necessarily entail a move to central dispatch system, or could the system work with self-dispatch as it happens currently in most of Europe?
Well, you know, you don't have to move to central dispatch. My own personal view is that you know, a more integrated approach to dispatch would be appropriate the more renewables you have on the system, because the more renewables you have on the system, the more the TSO has to get involved in market operations. So to me, the things seem to be drawing closer together. But I don't think, you know, a move towards central dispatch is absolutely necessary, but I think we might find it more attractive as we go forward and get more renewables on the system.
Thank you once more, and this was the last question for today. We have 3 minutes, so I wanted to hand back the mic back to you, Phil, to give us some concluding thoughts before finishing this webinar.
Okay, Christos, thanks very much. Well, I think, you know, for me, the sort of main takeaways are really that regionalisation holds out the potential of very extensive benefits, economic benefits, security benefits for all member states and consumers. You know, we need a very strong regional focus on system operation to get together with a very strong, transparent governance and regulation to make it all work and to gain those benefits. And, you know, if regionalisation is done well, and I think ROCs are a very important move in the right direction, then all member states and all European customers will reap the benefits.
Thank you very much, Phil. And if you could very quickly turn to the next slide for me, please. Here you can also find some additional resources. So we are now about to close the webinar. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time from your busy schedules to join us today. Our special thanks also to Phil and Julie for the valuable insights and their presentation. Very important for us, as you exit the webinar, you will see 3 survey questions appear. We would be really grateful if you could take a moment to provide us with some brief feedback on them. And finally, watch your email. We will be sending out links to the recording of the webinar and to the slide pack if you would like to have a look again. So thank you very much once again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.